Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. So thank you for joining me tonight. I'm excited to be speaking with you. Before we get started, I'm just doing a little bit of setup here. If you could do me a favor and let me know when you're taking the LSAT, if you've taken it before, when you're planning on taking it, what you're doing for your prep, just to give me a general sense of where you're at, and I'll use that to orient this conversation accordingly. So again, just in the chat here, do me a favor and let me know when you're taking the LSAT and if you've taken it before, what your plans are, and I'll use that to orient this conversation around your questions. Tonight, of course, is a little bit different because we're doing this in conjunction with an assistant dean of admissions at Drake Law School. Pretty exciting. So I'm excited to share her advice and wisdom with you in a bit. She'll be joining us shortly. But in the meantime, we'll jump off by talking a little bit about the LSAT. So if you could do me a favor and just here in the chat, let me know when you're taking the LSAT, what you're doing to prep, and I'll use that to orient this conversation appropriately. I see one person saying September. Awesome. That's a good amount of time. That gives you about 3 months. See someone else saying July 15th, someone else saying September. Got a mix of folks taking July and September, someone else taking it a year from now, summer 2020. That's awesome. So plenty of time there. That's great. So I'll give you just a brief overview of how I recommend studying for the LSAT. I recommend a 5-step approach. I call it the laser focus approach to LSAT prep. It's laser because it stands for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is doing your work untimed, doing questions by type, reviewing textbooks, learning theory. The phase one of LSAT prep with the laser focus approach is learning theory. Stage 2 is accuracy, doing questions untimed by type, perhaps individual questions, individual logical reasoning questions, individual games, individual passages. Stage 3 is sections, S for sections, doing full individual 35-minute timed sections, meaning 4 games or 4 passages or 25 or so logical reasoning questions. That is the next stage, and that helps you work on your pacing. Stage 4 is endurance or exams, doing full-length 5-section timed exams to properly simulate test day conditions. Then step 5 is the review process. The review process involves analyzing where your mistakes came from, if they were in the stimulus for logical reasoning, interpreting the question stem, or in the answer choices. If it was in the stimulus, you want to evaluate, did you understand the method of reasoning fully and thoroughly? If it was in the question stem, you want to make sure that you're thoroughly taking the time to understand what question type you're dealing with, what they're asking you for. And if it is in the answer choices, you want to see, was your mistake in being tempted by a particular wrong answer that seemed appealing, or were you discouraged from picking an unappealing correct answer? So there are these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answers and traps of discouragement away from the correct answers. You want to just check to see where your mistakes lay, because of course you're not falling for every single mistake, or else you'd likely be getting a 120. And so if there are particular mistakes that you are uniquely prone to making, you've got to figure out what those are so that you can avoid making those same mistakes in the future. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the 2019 LSAT changes with the coming digital LSAT happening this year specifically. A number of big changes, of course. The LSAT is going digital in July. Half of students get the old-fashioned paper and pencil format. The other half get the digital format. LSAC chooses for you, and you don't find out in advance, which of course is not the best position to be in, but LSAC is giving you some olive branches to make the transition a little bit easier. First off, for July, they're letting you see your score before you decide whether to cancel. And if you do cancel, you get a free retake on the LSAT through April 2020. And so normally I would say you don't ever want to cancel unless you know for a fact something went horribly wrong. But for the July LSAT in particular, canceling is not really that big a deal because so many people will be canceling in July, given the incentive to cancel, given the incentive of that free retake through April 2020. So if you're thinking of taking the LSAT in July, but you're not feeling 100% ready, I would say go ahead, take it anyway, even if you plan on canceling, because it may give you a 50-50 shot, of course, of getting the digital format, which will give you the unique opportunity to have a digital administration under your belt before you take it, quote unquote, for real in September. Now, some very recent news I should share with you. It used to be, of course, you could only take the LSAT 3 times in a 2-year period. LSAC had this limit on the number of times you could take the LSAT in a certain time frame. They recently removed that a couple of years ago, giving people the chance to take it unlimited times, no restrictions at all. But just this past week, LSAC walked back that change. They implemented a new change requiring that you have certain limits on when you can take the LSAT. And I will share that change with you here. This is going to be a screen share from LSAC's website showing you the new LSAT retake limit. So here, this is from their site, lsac.org. How many times may I take the LSAT? Starting with September, you can take it only 3 times in a single testing year and 5 times over the past 5 years, 7 times in a lifetime. This is forward-looking, not retroactive. Tests taken prior to September 2019 will not count against these limits. This means that if you take it in July, that will not count towards 3 times in a single year, 5 times in the past 5 years, 7 times in your life. But starting in September, they start making their tally. This, of course, will not affect a ton of people. Most people are not looking to take it 4 times in a single testing year, but you may want to consider that. If you cancel your score, that counts as a take. But if you withdraw your registration beforehand, or you are a no-show to the test itself, then this will not count towards the limit. Just keep that in mind. So that's one very recent change I wanted to share with you. The other recent changes, of course, are that the LSAT is going digital starting in July, then in September. LSAC has put out a familiarization tool at familiar.lsac.org. They have video walkthroughs. They have 3 full practice tests on there, 71, 73, and 74. So you can actually play around with the digital LSAT in that format. I'll show you some sample problems here so that you can see just what it looks like in terms of the different various features of the digital LSAT, because I do want to share some of those with you here. So you have, this is just a way for them to show you how to deal with the different features. Highlighting, underlining is particularly interesting. So you can highlight the text, you can underline the text, you can erase what you've highlighted, you can erase what you've underlined, you can increase the text size, you can decrease the text size, you can increase the line spacing. These are different various accessibility features. You can select an answer just by clicking there. You can also eliminate choices, which will make the answer choice text a little bit more gray. Kind of interesting. And then, of course, you can reveal the answer on just the digital LSAT familiarization tool, not on the actual administered LSAT itself, of course, but good things to be aware of. The highlighting and underlining features, I don't think they're especially super useful, but your mileage may vary. You may find it useful. And if you do, of course, then of course, do feel free to use it. It's kind of interesting. One thing you should be aware of is that for reading comprehension, you cannot see the entire passage at once. You have to scroll up and down, or you can display the passage only, but that will not let you see the questions at the same time. So just a few different things that you should be aware of there. Let's see, someone asked about changes in timing for the exam. Great question. So you do still get a 35-minute time constraint per section. That has not changed at all. But what has changed is the amount of time it will take you to bubble questions. Previously, you would have had to bubble with your pencil, slowly bubbling in every single answer for all 25 questions or so in a section. Now with one click of the mouse or touch of the screen with the stylus, you can see at a glance, you can do it instantly, and that might save you some time. Probably will save you a minute or 2 per question, per section, something to be aware of. Now, people ask about, should they practice with a tablet? I do recommend practicing with a tablet. LSAC is using the Microsoft Surface Go. You personally don't need to use that. Any old tablet will do. You could use a Samsung tablet. You could use an Amazon Fire tablet, which I have linked here in the chat. And you go on familiar.lsac.org, which I've linked here as well. and then you will be able to immediately see how it functions on the tablet itself. Very useful to be able to walk through in that way. I highly recommend using the tablet if you can. Again, any old tablet will do, but doing this on the whiteboard, doing this on a computer doesn't really do it justice. You can't use all the same different accessibility features that you can on the digital LSAT with the tablet. So just something to be aware of there. I want you to be familiar with. So I hope you found that helpful. A few other little things I do want to share with you here before I turn it over to Kara from Drake Law. I'll just go back to my screen share here. One thing with the digital LSAT is that you can only see one question at a time. So I recommend cutting out a rectangle in any old piece of paper and then placing it over an actual LSAT question so you can limit your field of vision to only one question at a time. I think this is extraordinarily useful to do because it is a little bit of a different experience doing it on a tablet versus doing it on a piece of paper. You want to treat all your prep test books as if they were PDFs. So if you have this PDFs, you can do those on the screen and then have your scratch paper to the side. And for logic games, by the way, I recommend doing something like this where you have your rules on the upper left, your main diagram on the right, then your individual question diagrams below. So let's say this were a 5-variable logic game with I would create 5 slots and draw my hypotheticals below, then have the PDF on the computer screen or have the prep test book to the side. I see another question here in the chat I do want to address. Someone asking about testing accommodations. If you have testing accommodations, that will not change. You will still have testing accommodations, but you will not be able to see your score immediately at the end of the test, as someone else asked here. You will still have to wait the standard amount of time. And actually, for the July LSAT in particular, it's going to take them longer to give your score back because they're doing some statistical calibrations and comparisons between the digital format and the paper and pencil format test takers. So you actually, for those of you taking July, you will not get your score back until August 28th. So that is an extremely long wait. Of course, it's about 6 or so weeks, much longer than usual, but that's just the case for July in particular. And then for the September LSAT, specifically for the July LSAT and beyond, actually, you will have the writing sample done digitally at home. And that was the case for June as well, actually. You're not doing that at the test center any longer. You're doing it on your own time. You have up to 1 year after your test administration to complete that. It's still not scored, of course, but given that it is typed, maybe law school admission officers will be more likely to look at it than they otherwise would have been. It will be typed, of course. It'll be more legible, but I wouldn't inordinately worry about that relative to the scored portions of the LSAT, of course. So that's a quick run through. I'm happy to entertain further questions on digital LSAT or anything else going forward. But for now, I do want to turn this over to Kara from Drake Law. Kara, feel free to unmute yourself here and dive right in to share what you have to share with everyone here. It looks like you're good. I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here tonight. So I'm Kara Blanchard. I'm the Assistant Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Drake Law School. Just a little bit briefly about Drake. We are located in Des Moines, Iowa, founded in 1865, so actually one of the 25 oldest law schools in the country. Drake's well known for providing very hands-on practical training, legal education. We have some unique features that I thought I'd share with everyone just briefly before I get into the admissions process and talking about the application process. Drake is a few unique things. We have several centers of excellence. We have centers of excellence in constitutional law, food and agricultural law, children's rights, and a legislative practice center. We also have a new Institute for Justice Reform and Innovation. That's a research and training center that is focused on topics of implicit bias and sentencing reform and improving trial proceedings. We have a freestanding, beautiful legal clinic here that offers a variety of different clinical programs, specifically in criminal law, general civil practice, elder law, children's rights, and then an entrepreneurial and transactional clinic. And beyond that, we have significant course offerings and certificates in a variety of different areas. Some of those include business law, criminal law, family law, environmental law, and international law. We have the country's only first-year trial practicum program, and that program brings a live trial. It's moved from our county courthouse to a beautiful courtroom that we have in our legal clinic here on campus. And we suspend our first-year classes for up to a week in the spring semester so that our first-year students can sit and observe the trial from beginning till end. They have a chance to be involved with faculty and attorneys who meet with them in breakout sessions to discuss trial proceedings. They get an opportunity to debrief the jurors and the judge at the end of the program. So it's a really fascinating learning program to learn about trial proceedings and actually watch that take place. We have a variety of co-curricular activities here at Drake. We have 2 student-published journals, our Drake Law Journal, and also we have a Food and Agricultural Law Journal here. Our bar passage and employment rates are always above the national average, and our students do quite well in both of those areas. We have alumni that are practicing in all 50 states and abroad. They are, for those that do decide to stay here in Des Moines, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Des Moines, it's very well known for a thriving young professional community. And a lot of our students from out of state actually fall in love with Des Moines when they get here and end up staying, even if that wasn't their original intention. But there are a lot of employment opportunities and a low cost of living. It's a nice sized community. We're actually the only law school here in Des Moines. And so that provides our students with ample opportunities for internships and clerkships and part-time work experience during their years here while they're in law school. So I encourage you to learn more. There's some really great things about Drake, and our website has all of the information that I've just covered, as well as many more things that are in depth. So I encourage you to visit and learn more about us. So I am going to dive into talking about the admissions process for those of you that are planning on applying here in the next year or two. I want to go over some of the major categories of the application process and hopefully share some information that will be helpful to you. So as Steve has just spent time talking about, the LSAT is obviously one thing that for most students will be required. There are some schools that are offering an option not to have an LSAT, but they're usually requiring another test, and as well as some of those schools are requiring enrollment in one of their joint degree programs. So I encourage you to look at schools individually in that area, but the vast majority of us are still requiring the LSAT. In addition to that, you typically have to have a bachelor's degree completed. The bachelor's degree can be in any area, so it doesn't have to be in a typical pre-law or political science type of major. We have a wide variety of students' backgrounds, majors that they come into with undergrad. So I tell our students not to feel at a disadvantage if they haven't pursued the typical undergraduate path for pre-law. We have students coming in with every major and have found that students can do very well in law school regardless of their undergraduate major. But your LSAT score and your grades are certainly going to be important components of the review process for an admissions committee. They'll not only be important for admissions, but also for competitiveness for merit-based scholarships. Most of us will take the higher LSAT score if you do take the test more than once. And I encourage you to talk with the admission officers at the schools you're looking at if you need advice on whether or not taking the LSAT a second time is something that you should consider. We're happy to have those conversations with you. Here at Drake, for example, over 75% of our entering students have qualified for scholarships in recent years. And so sometimes the retaking the test can not only be something that could help a student with admission, but also their eligibility for scholarship assistance. And so those are the types of conversations that the admissions staff are typically happy to have with students in helping to discuss that and determine whether or not retaking the test would be of value for you. Steve had mentioned LSAC.org in his conversation, and I certainly highly, highly recommend spending time on that website, not only because you need to set up your LSAT registration, but they also have a tab on their website that's called Choosing a Law School that provides some really good resources for researching law schools. All the ABA accredited law schools are listed. You can actually search by schools. You can get a link to every school's website. You can find some overview information that schools have provided to describe their programs. And you can even search by certain criteria to try and help you find schools that might be a good match for you. For example, you can search by GPA and LSAT if you have those scores and want to find schools in which you may be a competitive candidate for admission. Or you can search by geographic location or even keywords. So if there's an area of law you're really interested in, you can search by the type of law, and it'll bring up all the schools that offer programs in that area. There are a lot of ways to do your research on schools. LSAC.org's website is a fantastic resource and an easy way to get you linked with all the schools' websites. I know we had Dean Anderson on your program earlier, Steve, and he talked a little bit about rankings. I know that's an area that a lot of students will look at in their research as well. And I'll make one comment about that. Really, I think the biggest thing I think about rankings and working with students over the last couple of decades as they research law schools is that I first encourage each of you to think about the things that are important to you in choosing a law school. So whether that's a particular type of program, maybe it's even a scholarship eligibility, a certain geographic location, your areas of law, class size. There's a variety of different factors that you'll consider. And so when you make that list and think about the things that are important to you, then I encourage you to compare, when you're looking at rankings, how your factors of importance are included or not included in a ranking. And I think then that can make it more meaningful or purposeful to you as you're doing your research. So after you've done your research and you've decided how many law schools you wish to apply to, and the goal there is to narrow that down so that you don't have extreme expenses as you go through the application process, you'll need to create what's called a CAS, C-A-S, Credential Assembly Service subscription, and you sign up through LSAC.org to do that. The current cost this year is $195, and that's for a 5-year subscription. That will enable you to start the process of submitting all the required documentation that's needed by the law schools. So you'll have all of your undergraduate transcripts sent directly to LSAC, and that needs to include any school in which you've earned credit towards your bachelor's degree towards. So for those of you that may have attended multiple colleges or perhaps started a community college and transferred, you need to contact all the schools that you've earned college credit at and have them send their transcripts directly to LSAC. You can also have your letters of recommendation sent to LSAC, so they'll be included in this service. And they have a form on their website that you can use to send to your recommenders so that they know where to forward their letters to. I'd like to make one note about the letters of recommendation. I have found that the letters of recommendation that are most helpful to our students and to the admissions committee have been letters of recommendation from academic sources. So asking faculty who have taught you at the college level to write on your behalf can be a really useful piece of information for the admissions committee to consider. So I would strongly encourage you to have at least one letter of recommendation from an academic source. So you'll have your, as I talked about, your transcripts, your letters of recommendation, all forwarded for a part of this CAS report. It will all be, your transcript will be summarized, your letters will be included in a nice package that will be sent to the law schools that you apply to. And then the electronic application itself will be housed on LSAC as well. So you can complete the electronic application for every school to which you'd like to apply as part of that process. Now, the other components of the application that you are typically going to be required to submit will be a personal statement or some type of essay. I encourage you to read the instructions for each application very carefully. Some schools like us have an open-ended essay option where we don't really provide you any guidance as what you need to write about. We just like to learn more about you, and you can do that and write about anything you'd like in 2 pages or less. Some schools will give you very specific questions that they want answered as a part of the personal statement. So be sure to read over those carefully and submit the required information. I also encourage you to pay attention to the space limitations. So it is very common for schools to give you a page limit or perhaps a word count limit. And so that would be important to adhere to. Most schools will also offer you the option to submit a diversity statement if there's information that pertains to diversity that you would like included in your application. And typically you also have the option to submit any type of other optional attachments or essays. So for example, some students may need to explain something related to a question they answered in regards to character and fitness. Some students may wish to give us further explanation as to information that's on their transcript. For example, if they had 1 year in which perhaps their grades weren't as high as they were the other years, it can be useful for us to have a brief explanation as to the circumstances surrounding the particular semester or year in question. Again, I encourage you to be precise and succinct and not have too lengthy of documents, remembering that the admissions committees have hundreds or sometimes thousands of applications that they're reading in a given year. And so providing the information that you'd like to share in a very brief way can be helpful. So all of this information together will be components of your application that's reviewed by the admissions committee. I urge you to also pay very close attention to deadlines, as every law school is a little bit different as to when we will start accepting applications and when we have application deadlines or responses due. And so be sure to pay attention to that. It is certainly worth your time to also double check before you send any attachments. Make sure that you are submitting for example, the personal statement that might reference Drake Law School should be attached to the Drake Law School application, not to another school. Every year we get a few of those, and we'll have applicants contact us that can be a little bit embarrassed about sending the wrong statement to the wrong school. So just be sure and double check what you're sending prior to hitting the submit button. And then lastly, I would just note that you'll certainly want to double check to make sure that all of the materials that you sent, it would be your responsibility to make sure each school receives those. So most schools participate in what's called the online status checker, so you can actually check through your LSAC account to see if your application is complete. Otherwise, you could contact the admission offices at the schools in which you apply to make sure that they have everything they need. So I think that kind of hopefully gives you a brief summary of the application process and the items that are going to be needed for that. So with that, Steve, I think I'll wrap up that portion of it.
Thank you so much, Dean Blanchard, for that very detailed walkthrough on the law school admissions process at Drake, and just in general, extraordinarily useful to have the background and the overview. I want to just share briefly with folks a couple of the resources that you mentioned. My interview with Dean Anderson at Drake Law. I'll share with folks the YouTube video and the podcast episode if they want to check that out. So the YouTube video is right here. I've put the link to my discussion with Dean Anderson in the chat here. It's on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel at youtube.com/LSAT blog. And then for folks who would prefer the podcast version, I will share that as well. There's the podcast episode. I've also put the link here in the chat. It's on the LSAT Unplugged podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and pretty much everywhere else. Dean Anderson shared some extraordinary in-depth analyses of the U.S. News rankings and where they might fall short, what applicants may want to consider instead, or in addition to those criteria. So just wanted to put those resources out there for everyone, since it was quite a good walkthrough. Now, I just want to open this session up to anyone's general questions on the LSAT or the law school admissions process, either for myself or for Dean Blanchard, just walking through the LSAT and admissions, both sides of that. I have some thoughts as well, but I do want to open this up to everyone's questions. If they have anything in particular they want to ask, now's the chance. Well, I do have a question for you that I suppose folks might find interesting to hear your answer on. It relates to all the transitions happening with the LSAT going digital in July in particular. I'm wondering how your office might consider the results of July LSAT, considering that some folks might be nervous about the transition to going towards the digital end or getting the paper version or cancellations on that particular test date? Do you have any intuitions as to how your office might handle that?
Well, this is brand new for all of us, so we're not really sure what to expect. Although I will say the one thing that I think is encouraging for students is, especially if they're nervous about the changes, we're really pleased about the addition of multiple dates that'll be available every year so that students do have so many more options in which they could retest. And so that's something that, as I mentioned before, we certainly have been happy to have those conversations with students in the past. And definitely we'll, be expecting that we might have more questions about that until as we transition and students start to go through a different way, perhaps taking the LSAT, that it may even be another factor to consider in whether a student might want to retest until they become more comfortable with the changes.
Oh, thank you for that. So ultimately, I suppose that getting the score in the end is what ultimately matters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And just taking the test itself, the first time for some students that I've talked to over the years, just whether it's digital or paper, the nerves can certainly play a part for a lot of people. And so, I've certainly worked with students over the years who have taken the test a second time, and just having taken it the first time, knowing perhaps where their strengths and weaknesses were, and being able to alleviate a little bit of that first time test anxiety without knowing what to expect in the actual test situation. Sometimes just those things in and of themselves can kind of, be put to rest, and then the second test can go better for them just because of that.
Sure, absolutely. And even with the new limit of 3 takes in any one testing cycle, 3 chances is still a pretty good number to get it maybe on the second or third time, but you get there in the end.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier, but the GRE, is Drake Law taking the GRE? And if so, what are some circumstances under which an applicant might be well suited for the GRE as opposed to the LSAT?
Yeah, Drake is not accepting the GRE right now. It is something we've had some conversations about, although I have not had very many students, actually in the past year, none, who have asked me about it. But the reason that we aren't now is that the American Bar Association, our accrediting agency, does require schools before they offer that to be able to offer independent validation studies. And we just don't have the quantity of data that we would need to be able to produce that type of study right now. It's something we'll continue to monitor and think about, but as of right now, we do require the LSAT.
Okay, and related to LSAT scores specifically, are there cases in which getting a few points higher on the LSAT, is it as significant as just 1 or 2 points more making the difference between a yes or a no, or between getting more scholarship money or less? How do those numbers play in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I get that question quite a bit from applicants. 1 or 2 points typically isn't going to make a difference between yes or no. But having said that, there are certainly situations where 3 or 4, definitely 5 points could. So again, it really depends, and it's not, that test score in and of itself isn't the only thing that we're looking at. So it also depends on an applicant's GPA and then the other factors in the file that the admissions committee are considering. When we're looking at a big difference in what 1 point could make, it certainly could play a factor sometimes in scholarship eligibility. And so that's where, I encourage students in their conversations with admission offices as they're discussing their financial aid package. That could be a question worth asking. What would it take to make a change potentially in scholarship eligibility? Because sometimes, there have been students who I have advised strongly to consider retaking it, because the ability to perhaps take it again and get 2 or 3 points more, if there could be a big change in their scholarship eligibility, it could literally pay off for them to retake the test.
Well, it's very interesting. And it's also interesting to hear that it could be as simple as having a conversation with yourself, or if it's at another school, another admission officer, where it's not necessarily an adversarial relationship, where the applicant getting a higher score is good for you too.
That's very true. Yeah, that can be win-win for schools and applicants. So it's certainly, worth having the conversation, and admission officers that's what we're here for. So we're happy to field those phone calls and emails from applicants if they're wondering about ways in which they could become more competitive, either for admission or for scholarship eligibility.
Oh, great question. Great answer. Thank you for that. Got a question here from the audience. Someone asking, if there's a deadline to apply for a law school, could I finish an application and send it in when I haven't received my LSAT score yet?
Okay, so here at Drake, the answer to that is yes. So we have, for example, what we call our priority application deadline of April 1st every year. The vast majority of our applications actually come in by early to mid-February. So now that we have more test scores or test dates being offered, especially in the spring semester, that's something that we're seeing more of just this year, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of even next year. So we do allow students to go ahead and submit their application materials, and then we just hold the application until the test score is released. We have a question in our application that asks when a student will be taking the test, so if they note a future test date, we can also see that on their LSAC record once they've applied. So the answer could vary certainly from school to school, but here at Drake, it would be a yes for us.
Thank you for that. So at Drake, it's a yes, but for other schools, might be worth contacting them individually to ask. And of course, these deadlines, I get the sense that overall they're later than they used to be.
Oh yeah, for the most of us, they are. And you know, sometimes, or in recent years past, some of the schools had deadlines as early as perhaps late January even. We had the April 1st deadline so that we could accommodate February test takers. But with the addition of the later test dates, I would anticipate that there'll be many schools that'll have a little bit later dates.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, now it's being offered in March and April for even the same cycle. So you could start law school 6 months after having taken the LSAT.
Yeah.
And a lot of schools are taking those scores, I understand.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let's see. So some other general questions here. Somebody asked, what's the scoring scale? What does a good score look like? So I'll knock that one out just a little bit. The scoring scale is from 120 to 180. The median's about a 151. And a good LSAT score, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder, depends on your goals, right? I mean, I think anything above the median or above the average is considered good because you're doing better than the majority. But as for how much higher you want or need, depends on what your goals are. Do you want a top 14 law school? Do you need a full ride to law school? Or are you okay with going to tier 1 or tier 2? Or are you okay with going regional? And do you need the full ride or not? It's kind of depends, I think, in large part on your goals. What would you say on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, you know, that's where that LSAC.org choosing a law school feature that they have on their website can come in useful and handy for applicants, because a lot of the schools will post either a grid or some type of data that will show you based on your LSAT score and your GPA what your likelihood of admission would have been in the year prior. And so if there's a school that you really have your sights set on, you know, it's typically fairly easy to get in there and get the data to be able to see, you know, what kind of score you'd need to be competitive.
Yeah, thank you for that. I put the link in the chat, and if folks just Google LSAT GPA calculator, they'll find that as well on LSAC site. It's pretty interesting to walk through because, I mean, your GPA is probably fairly set in stone at this point. If you're already thinking about law school, maybe you're a junior, maybe you're a senior or a recent grad, but your LSAT score often weighs more heavily than the GPA, and you earn it typically over the course of 1 or 2 test administrations and maybe 3 to 5 months of studying at most. So it really is the biggest bang for your buck to get a higher score in the end. Mm-hmm. Got a question here about LSAT score cancellations in general. I'm wondering how you typically interpret a score cancellation, and if you might interpret it differently for July in particular, given that LSAC is giving the incentive to cancel one score to get that free retake.
You know, honestly, here at Drake, if I see one score that's canceled, it's nice if an applicant will just make a quick note in their application about it, whether they, you know, just felt like the test didn't go well and they wanted to cancel the score, or if they were absent from the test, you know, perhaps they were sick or some circumstances came up that prevented them from getting to the test site, or a reason that they needed to cancel. It's nice to just have a quick sentence or two included that explains that. Although just one cancellation or absenteeism isn't going to cause us big concern. I think where we would start to you know, wonder a little or perhaps have concern is if we see multiple cancellations or absenteeisms.
Certainly, certainly. And the cancellations and absenteeisms, for the most part, they're quite avoidable. I mean, what you can withdraw from the LSAT even the day before, if you're not feeling ready, law schools will never know that you were registered for that test date. So an absenteeism, in my opinion, should never happen unless, let's say, you woke up the morning of or something happened on the way to the test center that was unavoidable. And of course, there are contingency plans one can have, but that would be the only case, in my opinion, where that should ever even be a possibility. But the cancellations, I think July might be unique because LSAC is giving that incentive to cancel. But for other test administrations overall, I think maybe one cancellation is fine, but otherwise don't take it until you feel ready. Because you never know what could happen in the future that might require cancellation, like if the fire alarm goes off or the marching band's outside and you just can't overcome that obstacle.
Yeah, and Steve, I'd like to echo what you just said about waiting to take the test until you feel ready. I absolutely agree with that. You know, it's time consuming, it's expensive, and I don't encourage students to take the test the first time cold turkey just to see how it goes and to test the waters. You can do that online with practice tests, and there's, you know, really waiting until you have time to prepare for the test before you take it would absolutely be my advice as well.
100%. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions from anyone on LSAT or admissions in general? Happy to take your questions. Someone asked, what are the 5 subjects on the LSAT? I don't think there are only 5 subjects, to be honest. I think there are 3 sections overall: games, reasoning, and reading comp. But within those, there are many, many different subcategories. Too many to get into now. But if you go to my free LSAT course I've just released, I walk through everything in lots of details, bit.ly/free LSAT course, all lowercase. You can see all the details there. Someone asked for a list of schools that take the GRE. I think there are more and more all the time. I don't honestly know all of them, but I think if you Googled, you could probably find a list, but it's constantly changing. As for what is the GRE, it's the Graduate Record Examination, I believe, and it's normally been used for general graduate school like master's programs or PhD programs. Recently, some law schools have started taking it in part to widen their pool of potential applicants and maybe source some folks who may not have been initially considering law school. But it remains to be seen just how much the GRE is representative or indicative of one's law school potential. I think the LSAT is pretty strongly demonstrated to have a good correlation with first-year law school grades. And as you alluded to, Dean Blanchard, I'm not sure the data is fully in on just how indicative GRE scores are in comparison. They might be some indication, but my guess is not as good as the LSAT, but I suppose we'll see. I suppose we could leave off here, Dean Blanchard, but I do want to thank you for taking the time tonight. Do you want to share the best way for folks to get in touch with you or your office with further questions?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. Our website is law.drake.edu. So you can find just about any information you want there. You can also request additional information. And then my email and phone number are on that website as well.
Thank you so much for that, Dean Blanchard. I really appreciate it. So again, it's law.drake.edu. Folks can find me, Steve Schwartz, at the LSAT blog, as well as on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I put some of the links in the chat here, but feel free to reach out personally at lsatunplugged@gmail.com with any questions at all on LSAT prep. I'm happy to help however I can. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. All the best and have a good night. Take care.
Thanks. Good night.